So, welcome everybody to today's lecture from Monika Betzler, The Relational Value of Empathy. I want to thank Professor Betzler for coming and accepting our invite. We will also have tomorrow, starting at 3 p.m., a seminar about collegial relationship. I first shortly introduce Professor Betzler and then, of course, give her word. Monika Betzler is a full professor and chair of Chair for Ethics and Practical Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. She is also current director of Munich Ethics Center. She obtained her PhD at the same faculty, and after which she worked on commission at the European Union in Brussels, and was also appointed at the University of Göttingen. She finished also master degree, Master of Public Administration at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and was visiting scholar at the Philosophy Department. There, she was also a Theodore Lenin Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and Professional Fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Public Affairs at Tulane University in New Orleans. Upon passing her habilitation, she was appointed as full professor at the University of Bern, Switzerland, and she is also a member of the Swiss National Ethics Committee. Among many topics she thematizes are concepts of autonomy, empathy, interpersonal relation, and joint action. I mentioned just a few of her theses, which I found related to our projects and today and tomorrow topic. Regarding conception of joint action, Professor Betzler holds that theories based on the concepts of the intention and plural subject could not sufficiently explain joint action, at least some of kinds of joint actions, because they are neutral on a kind of interpersonal relationship between agents. She instead proposes important law which value of interpersonal relationship, and especially its kind, have for explaining joint action, as well what reason this relationship generates for those who are engaged in those actions. There is one another related concept which I want to mention from recent work of Professor Betzler, evaluative commitment. She uses the term evaluative commitment to designate normatively significant engagement one has in personal project or close relationship. For example, having engagement to finish a book about studies of engagement, or for example, the engagement that parents have to their children, which could be a reason not accepting probably some more interesting offer, for example, a job which could make me much richer because I have very strong emotional engagement, evaluative, normatively important engagement with those projects or close relationship. Following it, evaluative commitments relate us to many kinds of values and actually allow us to value things that give a content to our life, thus also understanding the value of engaging in such projects. Additionally, evaluative commitments make core of our normative identity and construct our general evaluative perspective. Today's lecture is about empathy. Professor Betzler doesn't argue about an a priori value of empathy as a kind of replacement for morality. She very good acknowledge critiques of empathy as an per se moral emotion. However, she tried to understand which value empathy actually has in regard to morality and find a way how we could speak about appropriate empathy. Again, with an emphasis on the importance of a kind of relation we are engaged in and relational value of empathy. So, thank you for my time.
Okay. So, hello everybody. I'm Monika, and I'm really excited to be here because it's the first time I'm in Belgrade and it's the first time I'm in Serbia, so it's a very new experience for me. And I'm really happy to be here. And please tell me if I'm speaking too fast. I might have an American drawl because I lived in the United States for quite some time, so if this is bad news for you, let me know. And also, I just click through the PowerPoint, but if there's a problem, point it out to me, because I can't always look, or I don't want to look backwards all the time. So my topic today is the relational value of empathy. And my background is that I did my habilitation on personal projects, and that's one kind of evaluative commitment. These are complex goals to which we devote ourselves, like having a career or having a hobby, maybe. And it's interesting because in action theory, these kinds of goals have been neglected. And action theory in general is very punctual and very static. And so what interests me are those diachronic engagements and what kinds of reasons they give us. And personal projects are one type of engagement, and personal relationships are another type of long-term engagements that interest me. And I think they have been vastly neglected in moral theorizing, but also in theories of practical reason more generally. And there's also an interesting link to normative ethics, because there's a lot of criticism put forward against consequentialism for not being able to accommodate personal relationships, because consequentialism is an ethical theory that's always about maximizing the general good. And if you take that for granted, it's very difficult to conceptualize that relationships, your own relationships actually matter, because consequentialists would ask you always to maximize the good impersonally conceived. So you would always have to do more to rescue children in Africa than do something for your own children, if that moral theory is correct. So there are interesting bearings on other strands in normative ethics when we look into relationships. So anyhow, today, since I'm also very interested in the moral psychology of relationships, I want to look more into empathy and its role it has with regard to relationships, and then I want to draw some, I think, interesting consequences about the bearing empathy has for morality, because I think some people overestimate the bearing empathy has for morality, which does not mean that it's not important, but I do think it's not a basis for moral reasoning necessarily. And another issue I'm interested in, but I won't touch upon it today, is trust, which is also a very interesting moral psychological attitude when it comes to relationships. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I better get started. Philosophers and psychologists about in the past 30 years have not only in the past 30 years, but there has been a rise in interest, especially also in psychology, on what role empathy plays in our moral lives. Especially developmental psychologists are very interested in what role empathy plays in small children when they develop sort of quasi-moral behavior in helping other children, for example, or comforting other children. Psychologists hypothesize that empathy plays a very important role when it comes to our moral development. And historically, in philosophy, that goes back to the sentimentalist tradition in British and Scottish empiricism, where people like David Hume and Adam Smith thought empathy, they called it sympathy, but what they meant was what we now call empathy is at the core of morality. So on first inspection, one might think that there is a very close connection between empathy and morality. Namely, one could say that those who empathize care more about others' well-being, and that sounds moral, that if I empathize with you, I'm more attentive to your needs, so I care more about your needs and I will do more to cater to your needs. And if I empathize, I might also respect your autonomy more, because I see you as another person who has feelings and a perspective of her own. So one might therefore conclude that there is either a very close causal connection, that empathy gives us reasons, causal reasons, to act morally, or even as something, a conceptual connection, that being empathetic is nothing else than being morally inclined. So in more recent years, or maybe upon closer scrutiny at least, the connection between empathy and morality seems much more difficult to come to grips with than this initial portray might suggest. Why is that? What speaks against the causal connection, for example, is that empathy is an attitude that's directed to another person's emotions. And I will come to that in more detail, how I define, or how empathy is typically defined. Let's just start with the general intuition, and I guess everybody has a general intuition what empathy is. So one could question whether it always leads to moral action. For example, if you take delight in the joy of another person, you know, that might be you empathize with another person's joy, but that doesn't necessarily, because that's a good thing, that doesn't motivate you to do something morally about that person, right? Or even if you empathize, let's suppose Igor is very angry and I have empathy with his anger. If I really empathize strongly, I might go against the cause of his anger, and that would be pretty immoral, right? So it's not a given that empathy motivates us to act morally. And what one could also take issue with the claim that there is a strong conceptual connection. There's an important American philosopher called Michael Float, who's very famous for thinking that empathy is all there is and all we need to ground morality. So he basically thinks empathy and morality are conceptually connected. But what speaks against such kind of even closer link is that empathy involves what people call partiality or favoritism, or if worst comes to worst, nepotism, right? Because I can't empathize with the anonymous, you know, mass of humankind. I always pick out single persons with whom I empathize. So the danger is that this leads to, you know, preferring some to the detriment of others. And Jesse Prince, a moral psychologist, an American moral psychologist, published a paper in 2011 who thinks morality and empathy have nothing to do with each other, precisely because empathy can lead to favoritism, leads to bias. We empathize more with cute little kids or pretty people than with ugly-looking people. So it's conducive to all kinds of irrationalities that might explain, he thinks, that empathy and morality actually, he thinks, totally opposing concepts. If we want to put it a little more mildly, they are at least potentially conflicting concepts. Moreover, we can also empathize too little or too much. And we can empathize with a mafioso, which is an immoral person, let's suppose. So that, again, has nothing to do with morality. And these are just scattered examples and remarks, but they should suffice to show that empathy is neither necessary nor sufficient for morality. Now, this skeptical diagnosis has inspired proponents of an empathy-based morality to come up with more sophisticated proposals, which is always the case in the philosophical dialectic, right? If people get criticized, they just come up with a more fine-grained idea about what empathy really is. So some of them think there are actually three attempts to come up with such a more sophisticated account of empathy. So one attempt, so they think if we sort of have a more sophisticated understanding what empathy is, we don't just take regular empathy, we have to qualify it. And if we qualify it, then that kind of empathy serves as the right basis of morality. Now we can distinguish three sets of proposals that all try to qualify empathy in some sense. Now, the first proposal thinks we have to regulate our practice of empathy and restrict the object that empathy may take so as to qualify as moral. So we shouldn't empathize with a sadist or with a mafioso, but we should always empathize, or empathy is only okay, so to speak, if it's directed towards the well-being of others. That's one proposal. They try to narrow the object empathy can take. Or others, that's actually a very old idea, going back to Adam Smith in the 18th century, say we should broaden empathy, we should universalize empathy, and engage in empathy that, how Smith puts it, an impartial spectator would feel. That's like somebody who thinks about who empathizes with every person affected and tries to imagine from an impartial point of view that person's feelings. So against these, I mean, there are neat ways, right, to qualify empathy so that it passes moral muster. But what speaks against the first proposal to say, well, empathy proper, so to speak, is only empathy we take towards the well-being of others, is just an ad hoc solution. And the attempt to just broaden the scope of empathy and say we should have like impartial empathy, one could say or object to that this is actually a contradictio in adjecto, because empathy just is defined by not being impartial. It's just an attitude we always take towards individual, singular people. And if we agree on that, it's by definition partial, right? It's conceptually impossible to empathize with everybody. That's just not something we can do. So as for, and if we were able to empathize with everybody, right, we would have to be able to empathize with conflicting perspectives. So I might have to empathize with your pride and his shame, and how would that go together, right? So that's why I think it's conceptually impossible to have impartial empathy. Now, the second set of proposals might look a little bit more promising. And people who came up with this proposal, they think we accept that empathy is partial. What we have to do is accept that and balance it against other moral principles, such as Kantian respect, justice, autonomy, or what have you. So, you know, what we need to admit is that it has some space, but we need to balance it in our moral reasoning against other moral principles. So they admit that empathy may only go so far as not to conflict with moral principles. The problem with this proposal is not that it's entirely wrong, but it's totally unclear how we should navigate between empathy and other moral principles. How should I know when to empathize, and how should I know when to stop empathizing and resort to principles of justice, for example? So as a result, one might think neither the first nor the second attempt to qualify empathy explains why we should and how we could accord empathy its proper place in the moral domain. Now, more recently, a third set of proposals has been offered, and that goes like that. it thinks that empathy has particular epistemic value. And what's the epistemic value of empathy? It's an attitude that by sort of feeling how another person feels, these people think we acquire information why another person feels the way she does. So we acquire a particular kind of information, and we acquire it in a shortcut way by apprehending another person's emotions in virtue of feeling it ourselves. And that this value can be the basis of defeasible moral reasons because, in some contexts, it's important to feel another person's pain, and it's morally important to acquire that kind of information because it's a morally relevant kind of information. Again, with this proposal, I don't think that this proposal is wrong, but I also think it's incomplete and that we should amend it, and that's what I'm trying to do today. So I think what about the first set of proposals got right, that empathy's exercise needs to be restricted. Empathy per se and as such does never lead us to morality. So we have to think about how to regulate the exercise of empathy so that it qualifies as a moral attitude. I think that's right. I also think the second set of proposals is right to the extent that sometimes we do have to balance between empathy and other moral principles. And I think the third set about the epistemic value of empathy is right in that there is something especially valuable about empathy. And I think the epistemic value is one aspect, but I think there is another aspect to empathy's value that might be even more interesting when it comes to morality. So in light of this background, the aim of my talk today is the following. I want to illuminate a particular value of empathy that I think has been largely overlooked in the whole debate on empathy and morality, and that's what I call the distinct relational value of empathy. And for the remainder of this talk, I'll try to spell this out, what that means, what the relational value of empathy consists in. And very broadly and roughly speaking, empathy, I think, is distinctively valuable as it helps us to enter into a relationship to another person and make a close connection to another person. But I will go into this in far more detail. And once we understand empathy's relational value, we might have, or the hope is that we then have a better basis to account for how we have to restrict empathy so that it doesn't conflict with moral reasoning internally and externally, by regulating it in its exercise, but also by balancing it against other values. So in the end, I will argue for a normative connection, not a causal connection, not a conceptual connection, but a normative connection between empathy and morality. So my claim is that to the extent, and if I'm able to show that empathy has distinct relational value, it generates morally relevant yet defeasible reasons. So it's a rather modest claim. I certainly don't believe that this is all there is to morality. So the structure is the following. I started out with the introduction, how not to conceive of the connection between empathy and morality. So these are my opponents. Now I'm trying to give a very brief account of empathy in terms of its, what I call, ideal function. This could be a paper of its own, so it will be too short, but I have to say something about what empathy is. So far I only alluded to it and counted on your intuitions, so we definitely have to come up with some better conception of empathy. And in light of that, I will come to the question, or try to explore what its relational value consists in. And this will lead me to spell out what I call its intrinsic and extrinsic features of empathy's relational value. And then towards the end, I hope that will put me in a position to say at least a little bit more about the relevance of empathy for morality. Okay, so let's start with the second part, what I call the ideal function of empathy. Now, whenever you want to work on empathy as a philosopher, what's really iffy is that there are lots of conceptions out in the literature. And it's not only philosophers working on empathy, it's neuroscientists working on empathy, it's psychologists working on empathy. So you've got a whole array of people, like millions now, hundreds of people thinking about empathy. So, which doesn't make it easier to conceptualize, because different disciplines have different approaches. So very recently, a psychologist counted the conceptions or definitions of empathy that are out in the literature, and he came up, interestingly, it's funnily enough, with 43 different conceptions of empathy. So what do we do in light of this? What I'm going to do is, I'm not so happy with a merely psychological account of empathy. What interests me much more, given that I'm interested in the connection between empathy and morality, is what I call a normative conception of empathy. And why I think a merely descriptive account doesn't fulfill the job is the following. In our, what I call normative practices, we sometimes criticize people for not being empathetic enough, right? Well, you should empathize if you want to be moral. Or, you know, that's like we say to people, you should be nice to somebody. So we ask people to be more empathetic, or we blame people for not showing enough empathy. We do that all the time, and that shows that there is an interesting normative aspect of empathy, and that's because empathy is a capacity. It's a human capacity that we can train better overs, and that has led some philosophers even to think of empathy as a virtue. I'm not opposed to this, but I do think it's a capacity that can be trained, and therefore it makes sense to praise or blame people for not being sufficiently empathetic or for being empathetic. Against this idea, there is despite those 43 definitions, there is something like a standard account in contemporary analytic philosophy about what empathy is. And here it is. And you find that in many articles that people refer to this. So according to that standard account of empathy, empathy is the following. A person P, which one often calls the subject, empathizes with person Q, the target, if P is aware and apprehends Q's internal experience E. That means, to spell this out, I'm sorry, Igor, I just pick you out as an example. If I empathize with Igor, I need to empathize with his internal experience. And usually that's a range of emotions, or it could be just one emotion. And I need to put myself into Igor's perspective and sort of simulate, as some people say, his emotion. So that means I experience what I call E star here. I experience an emotion that is sufficiently similar to Igor's. Not the same, because after all, it's Igor's emotion, but putting myself in his perspective to an extent that I'm able to see things as he sees them, I will feel something similar as he does. Otherwise, I'm not empathizing. So it has to be sufficiently similar. And I do that knowing that it's Igor's emotion, not mine. So we have to differentiate empathy from emotional contagion or mere mirroring. That's a phenomenon babies are able to do. One baby cries, the other one starts crying. But babies don't have the cognitive capacities to think, oh, how is this baby feeling? Right? That's not what babies do. They just get swamped over by this emotion. And that's different. So empathy differs from this mere contagion in that I'm able to maintain self-other asymmetry. So I still know it's about Igor, not about me. It's about his situation, not about mine. But I still simulate his situation, his perspective, and come to feel something similar. And spelling it out that way tells you already that it's not so easy to do that, actually, because you have to fulfill a lot of conditions to actually be able to fully empathize in that sense. Now, I think if this is the standard account, and I'm just telling you it's the standard account that many philosophers have come to share, it's in some important ways too narrow, because I think it reduces empathy to an intrapersonal, merely psychological phenomenon. But actually, coming to think about it more closely, empathy is an interpersonal. It's a phenomenon between persons. Even if it manifests itself, obviously, in my psychology, it wouldn't be possible without another person with whom I empathize. So it takes two to empathize. And so it's helpful to conceptualize empathy such that it serves that ideal, because the idea, what I call the ideal function of empathy, if empathy works well, so to speak, works in a way that we tend to call people to do it, is that it achieves a social purpose. And that social purpose is to properly relate to others by empathizing. And that's what empathy is good for. That's what I mean by ideal function. It's synonymous to what it is good for. Its point is to relate to others by coming to feel the way they feel. And this idea that it is an interpersonal phenomenon intuitively explains our normative practices. For example, if a sadist takes joy in another person's pain, and some philosophers think that's empathy. I think it doesn't qualify as empathy because it doesn't fulfill a social purpose at all, and it doesn't fulfill its ideal function. And there is also independent support for this claim by social psychology. So-called relational models theory, for example, claims that the point of empathy is to shape one's relationships accordingly. So it's not just that I have something in my mind. I need to understand the other person's position. The other person has to talk to me, has to convey information to me so that I'm actually able to empathize. And sometimes one exchanges answers and questions. How was that for you? And the other person has to answer these questions. Otherwise, empathy will not occur. I won't be able to empathize. Now, to explain further why I think the standard account is inadequate and why we need a more interrelational account of empathy, I want to resort to an example, and that will help me for the rest of this paper to spell out these very abstract claims, person P and person Q, by way of an example which makes it more vivid and more lively. So what I chose is an example from Elena Ferrante, who's become a very famous Italian author. I don't know whether you're familiar. You are. So the book it's called in English, The Days of Abandonment, Il Abbandono in Italian. And it's just a very small scenario out of the book. The whole book is about a woman called Olga who is being left by her husband, unilaterally, so to speak. And the whole book is about what Olga goes through. So the protagonist, Olga, has unexpectedly, to her, totally unexpectedly been informed, there's a typo, it's been informed by her husband, Mario, that he will leave her for 20-year-old Carla. And now here's a quote of Olga's train of thought upon that information. Quote, "I could not calm down. Was it possible that Mario should leave me like this without warning? It seemed to me incredible that all of a sudden he had become uninterested in my life. Like a plant watered for years that is abruptly allowed to die of drought. I couldn't conceive that he had unilaterally decided that he no longer owed me any attention." End of quote. And she continues, "I began to change. In the course of a month, I lost the habit of putting makeup carefully. I went from using a refined language, attentive to the feelings of others, to a sarcastic way of expressing myself, punctuated by coarse laughter, and the nights, nearly sleepless already, became a torment. Where was I coming from? What was I becoming?" End of quote. Now we learn from these passages that Olga feels let down, rejected, unloved, and angry of her husband. Now, in light of this scenario, we can point to the interpersonal side of empathy that I'm trying to get at. Now let's take Leah, who's also a figure in that novel. That's a friend of Olga. Even it's not so clear in the novel how good a friend Leah actually is, but let's suppose Leah is a good friend. Now, only when Olga is ready to express herself and to communicate her particular situation of abandonment to her friend Leah, and only when Leah is ready to listen and to show the open-mindedness necessary to pick up on that information, can empathy occur. But if Leah has never been left by a man, maybe she doesn't get it. Who knows? And if Olga doesn't convey further information about how that happened, it might be far too difficult to properly or accurately empathize. So what I call the first layer of relationality is that there has to be a dynamic relationship between subject and target, or Olga and Leah, via various modes of exchange for empathy to occur. So that's why it takes two to empathize. So empathy in that sense proves to be an interpersonal and not merely an intrapersonal phenomenon, as it presupposes a basic relation between two people for its existence. Right? Otherwise, we are very hard put to empathize at all. And it also shows, I think, that the standard account is not only too intra, but it's also too static, because empathy is a dynamic process. So for empathy to arise, it must be grounded in a more dynamic interpersonal relation between two people. So they convey information, you ask questions back, and you sort of try to adjust how things are for the other person. Now the source of value, one might say, in empathy is the relationship that is forged between two people. And that brings me, if this is all, if you share this view that there is something more interpersonal to empathy, what I call the first layer of relationality, that this is actually what empathy is, it's an interpersonal phenomenon, that puts us in a better position to ask what the source of the relational value of empathy is. Now, to substantiate that claim, let's look into cases where empathy is failing and draw from there what's missing when we have a case of failed empathy. Now, let's change the scenarios, because Leah could also respond by not showing empathy. For example, Leah, and that's the first scenario, might share Olga's belief about Mario, that he's actually a terrible man, but maybe she doesn't share Olga's feelings. That's one case. The second is Leah is totally indifferent to Olga and her situation. Or third case, Leah has different beliefs about Mario and Olga's situation and does not share Olga's feelings at all. Now, as for the first case, where Leah doesn't share Olga's feelings, that's a case of what some people call cognitive empathy. So she just sort of understands what's going on, but she doesn't come to feel the same way as Olga does. And then Leah, if she doesn't feel the way Olga does, Leah cannot understand why Olga feels the way she does. And therefore, Leah cannot lend further warrant, as I call it, or justification to Olga's response by not feeling what Olga is feeling. And only in coming to, so what's missing is, if you don't feel the way the other person is feeling, you can't, reflect back to that person that the way she feels is actually, there is something to feeling that way. Now, if we look at the second case, by remaining indifferent, Leah fails to be concerned about her friend, and she fails to give credibility to Olga's evaluative perspective, thus undermining her status as being a good or bad judge of her situation. One could also question whether she's a friend at all if she remains indifferent to her friend Olga's situation. And as for the third case, since Leah holds opposing beliefs, so she thinks that's actually not so terrible what happened to Olga, she's even more likely to dismiss Olga's feelings and undermines that justificatory basis. And as a result, Olga will feel even more rejected. So to draw out the consequences of this discussion of cases where we imagine what happens when there is no empathy, we can say these are all instances of a failed connection between Leah and Olga. Conversely, what can we learn from these cases of failed empathy? We can ask, if empathy had not failed, what value could have been created? Now, Leah would have communicated that Olga is right about how she experiences her situation. It provides Olga with an opportunity to open up and feel acknowledged in her perspective, and ultimately in who she is. And that helps me to bring to the fore what I call the second layer of relationality, in being able to empathize with another person and with the feelings she's going through. Empathy provides what I call recognition and evaluative justice. What do I mean by that? If Leah comes to empathize with Olga and feels sufficiently similar in light of Mario's abandonment to how Olga feels, she shows that Olga is actually right the way she feels about that situation. And therefore she provides Olga with recognition in the veridicality of her emotions. And she's evaluatively just, and that means she gives credit to Olga's testimony about what had happened to her. Whereas if she dismissed it as, this is not so bad. I mean, partners leave all the time. What's the big fuss about it? That won't make any close connection between the two. Now, even if this is by and large true, even if you accept that, there's an important objection looming in the background. After all, even if I claim, empathy is really important to create a valuable relationship, or is the source of value, is a relational value, is a source of relational value, one could say, well, empathy does not always create valuable relationships. So if that's true, empathy is not always the source of relational value. For example, empathic powers can be used in manipulative ways. For example, Leah might suffer from helper syndrome and empathize in a way that might not be so good for Olga. And maybe you know people like that who have a very strong tendency to empathize all the time, and they use that to manipulate people. So that's a problem. And also, we can over-empathize in other ways, and that might be very paternalistic, right, if we do that too much and all the time, and we can empathize inaccurately. So Leah might think Olga is angry, but maybe Olga is not angry, but just deeply sad. Then, empathy is not successful, really, because she doesn't even feel the feelings that Olga has, but gets it wrong. So empathy is at risk of being inaccurate. And, there are cases where people don't welcome empathy because it puts them down. So what do we do with these cases? Because they might show that there is not that much value, relational value to empathy. So I think these cases in which empathy fails to establish a relation teach us something about which criteria empathy has to meet. Now, for empathy to result in a meaningful relationship, and thus to be a source of relational value, it must be realized on behalf, so I just tried to amend my theory, it must be realized on behalf of the target, it must be sufficiently accurate, it must resonate sufficiently with an experience that's relevant and meaningful to the target, and it must be accepted by the target. And these are conditions. So these conditions have to be in place for the existence of empathy's relational value to come about. I admit that. And only they guarantee that empathy can bring about a valuable relation. So this is not every relationship qualifies as such. So I hope to have made a first case for empathy's relational value, and now it's time to analyze in more detail what precisely is the source of that relational value. Now, the value of empathy is based, this relational value is based on more specific ways in which the subject and the target, Olga and Leah, relate to each other. And as I try to capture it, now resorting to axiology, theory of value, I think they're both intrinsic and extrinsic qualities that render empathy relational valuable for its own sake. Now, what's intrinsically valuable in empathy? Now, the source of empathy's value is extrinsic to the experiential character of empathy and the mental states involved. So if the experiences of the target are positive, experiencing them as a subject will result in feelings of pleasantness. The target feels that she's receiving empathy, is being taken seriously, and is worthy of attention, all of which adds to the pleasurable quality of her experiences. And the subject feels then that she has a positive effect on the target, which will enhance her own positive experiences. So empathy in that sense is valuable as it implies that we relate to each other through sharing experiences, which results in both parties being in harmony with one another, because it's pleasant to do that in the case of positive experiences. And so we respond to each other in these positive ways, which brings us into a positive reinforcing cycle of feelings of pleasantness and harmony. But again, one might worry, what about negative emotions? Because we also empathize, and that's what Leah precisely does. She empathizes with Olga's negative emotions. And that's obviously not pleasant. So what's the value in that? Well, one could say that responding appropriately to what another person is experiencing is still a source of value. It's valuable to have appropriate responses. And Leah makes a normative case for Olga's experiences as being justified. For example, Leah, by coming to feel similar sorrow as Olga does, Leah disvalues the disvalue of Olga's sorrow. So she actually makes a case that this is a bad feeling and this is valuable for Olga to get this reflected back, that she is right about feeling the way she does. And so in that sense, empathy is valuable as it creates meaning. And it creates that meaning because it appropriately responds to something of value or disvalue. Hence, we can say that empathy is relationally valuable for its own sake in responding appropriately to the experiences of another person, and there is value in so responding. So it manifests pleasantness, harmony, and meaning. And as a fitting attitude in being an appropriate response, empathy additionally provides warrant to another person's emotions. And one can say that's extrinsically valuable, and in that it's not grounded in the experiential qualities of empathy itself, but in its relation to what it does to another person. For example, Olga will perceive herself as being affirmed. She receives affirmation of her feelings. This affirmation extends to her as a person. She's recognized as the person and how she sees things. Olga will feel accepted and recognized as the person she is in virtue of Leah's affirmation. And empathy thus ultimately responds to the value of an individual person in virtue of vicariously experiencing the evaluative perspective that person experiences. So as a result from its extrinsic qualities, we can say that empathy is relationally valuable for its own sake in virtue of the recognition it provides for the person empathized with. And that has further valuable consequences, because if we receive recognition from others, that can enhance our self-esteem and self-trust. A person empathized with, that's why it's so important for children to receive empathy. A person can trust herself more easily in that she's able to assess things right. And empathy is a way of providing testimonial justice in affirming their evaluative testimony and convey to others that they matter to the empathizing person. Now, here one could object, well, does empathy really provide that warrant and that recognition and all these values? Because one could claim that in empathizing, Leah might get things just as wrong as Olga. Right? It's not just because I have similar feelings than you do, and just because I see your situation the way you do, doesn't mean that we see it right. We could just both be wrong in seeing it the way we do. And then one could claim, well, then that just shows that this doubles the unjustifiedness of the particular perspective of the person empathized with. Well, in response to this objection, I would say the following. It's true, empathy doesn't provide in all things considered justification from God's viewpoint. It's true, even Leah might overreact to the situation. what I think that Leah's empathy does is that it does add a further testimonial justification to Olga's. And in that sense, it provides additional evidence that Olga is right. If already two people come to see things in the same way, maybe that is additional evidence that there is something true to that perspective. But, you know, we don't have full proof for that I admit. So I think the justification or warrant that empathy can provide continues to be perspectival and not objectivist. There's just no objectivist viewpoint to be had. But I do think it's additional evidence that Olga, if we go back to the example, sees things right. Now, this leads me to a preliminary summary. To the extent that recognition is a source of value by enhancing the self-esteem and self-trust of another person, and in light of the fact that empathy is valuable in virtue of the recognition it provides, empathy is extrinsically valuable for its own sake. And it's valuable in virtue of the relation it forges to others. So, I don't know how we do on time and how long you want me. It's 8 now, and I still have I can skip a section if you want me to. 10 minutes? Okay. Let me just quickly think. Okay, I think I can manage. Now, I will now show in what way empathy is constitutively valuable, and that it helps to establish and maintain relationships. And to the extent that empathy is valuable for its own sake in virtue of its intrinsic and extrinsic properties. Intrinsic, recall, is the pleasantness, the circle of pleasant feelings and harmony it provides, the meaning it provides, and the extrinsic properties is the recognition it gives to other people by way of feeling the same way, and the testimonial justice it gives to other people. Now, these two sets of properties themselves help to constitute what I call the third layer of relationality, and that's because empathy is, in virtue of having these evaluative properties, is a building block of relationships, not just a one-off relation to another person. And relationships differ in that sense, in that they don't involve just single instances of relating, but more enduring, substantive, and mutually affirmed interactions between two or more persons leading them. So empathy targets an individual, but also the relation with that individual as it unfolds in the exchange of emotional perspectives. And then it encourages what I call an ongoing chain of reciprocity. So if Leah manages to empathize with Olga, Olga will come to regard Leah as goodwill towards her. She will seek her company more, and she will be more prone to like her and more ready to give the same back to Leah. And this is what I mean by sequences of exchanges that more easily turn into an ongoing relationship. Now, in our case, they already have a relationship, but it can also so happen that empathy is a building block for a relationship to unfold. Now, I will skip this. Now, we can compare this to cases in which empathy, for example, is not welcome. If we find intimacy inappropriate, for example, we do not welcome the intimate bond that empathy creates. Sometimes we don't want empathy because we don't want to be that close with a particular person, but that just substantiates my claim that empathy does forge that connection to others that eventually can build into a relationship. But to further bring out how empathy constitutes the value of, or builds up the value, or is a building block of the value of relationships, let me resort to so-called relationship goods. that parties in a relationship are thought to co-create. And now I draw from theories on relationships. They say relationships like friendships or partnerships or family relationships or other kinds of close relationships are valuable because the parties involved co-create, as they say, certain goods, such as intimacy, mutual concern, common purposes, shared experiences, trust, assistance, and favor. And this is just an incomplete list. Now, one could say empathy is part of intimacy that encompasses shared experiences. And so if we apply this to Olga and Leah, we could say, what exactly helps explain empathy's contribution to their friendship? Now, one might say empathy enhances trust and security from the ill will of the other by feeling recognized, singled out, and by receiving testimonial justice. Olga thus opens up to Leah, as Leah no longer weighs the reasons for or against her. She will continue seeking Leah's company and develop an interest in co-creating further relationship goods with her. Moreover, empathy creates attachment. If Leah empathizes with Olga and Olga feels empathized with, their respective sense of closeness and belonging will be fostered. So empathy caters to the need to belong. It will provide reasons to seek and provide empathy, not just once, but on a more regular basis. So it encourages us to continue a relationship with the person who's able to empathize with us. And empathy enhances loving attitudes and affection. If Leah affirms Olga's perspective in how she experiences her situation, she responds to what Olga values or disvalues, and ultimately to Olga. And in return, Olga feels singled out and is more likely to develop a positive attitude towards Leah, because we feel liked if somebody empathizes with us, and we do that because we feel affirmed in our perspective. And in that sense, receiving empathy creates the feeling of being liked or loved, which in turn enhances, in Olga's case, her own positive feelings towards Leah. And this brings me to the resulting argument. If trust, security from the ill will of the other, attachment as well as loving affection are the most important relationship goods that are co-created in close relationships, and if empathy fosters such goods, empathy is also, next to its intrinsic and extrinsic properties, a constitutive value for relationships, for close personal relationships, such as friendship. Now I have various objections that I'm skipping now, and maybe you have some as well in the question and answer section. Let me just point to some empirical research towards the end that helps me bolster my claim. There are, for example, studies that show that there is a close connection between a close relationship and a high level of empathy, and between malfunctioning close relationships and a lack of empathy. There are also studies in social psychology that show that emotional intelligence, empathy, and reports of relationship satisfaction are linked. Moreover, patients with psychiatric illnesses, for example in the autistic spectrum, who are hard put to empathize with others, have trouble leading satisfying close relationships. And I think this is just a scattered example, some scattered examples from empirical research in psychology that further bolsters my view that there is a link between empathy and close relationships that I call the third layer of empathy's relationality that is realized in virtue of the constitutive value of empathy's intrinsic and extrinsic properties. Now back to morality very shortly. I think it's empathy's, once we better understand this relational value of empathy, we're also in a better position to explain why it's sometimes morally required to empathize and sometimes morally required to abstain from empathy. And I think the 3 layers of empathy's relational value non-arbitrarily explain why the existence and why the exercise of empathy should be restricted. We do have defeasible reasons to empathize if empathy is relational valuable, but we don't have those reasons if it's not relationally valuable. And empathy can be morally required by a particular relationship. For example, if Leah wants to be a good friend, she should empathize, and she's morally required to do so. But the reasons to empathize are defeasible only and don't amount to an absolute duty. Why? We don't have reasons to empathize all the time and to a maximum degree. What's important for the relational value of empathy to be realized is that we empathize in cases where empathy is called for example, when others are in particular need or are in situations that highly matter to them. Otherwise, I think it's totally fine to empathize less fully and less often, and this opens the room to balance empathy against other values of moral impartiality. In moral decisions, when it comes to making moral decisions, we do not only appeal to the relational value of empathy, but also to other considerations, such as whether empathy prevents us from doing something else that's good or morally required, and that opens room for impartial concerns. So the connection between empathy and morality is normative. Sometimes we do have moral reasons to empathize because that's required by the relationship we lead. But sometimes we have moral reasons not to empathize, and that's required by other considerations of morality. It's up to our moral capacities to decide which conditions call for what. Empathy relates us to others in distinctive, valuable ways, but that can, but need not be, what morality demands. So morality is a much broader concept than empathy. So as a result, my claim is pretty modest. To the extent that empathy has relational value, it gives rise to defeasible moral reasons, and they're moral because some other person is involved. But to the extent that this distinctive relational value is not always called for by moral reasons, it could be nepotistic, it could be too partial given that other things are at stake. We can also sometimes have moral reasons not to empathize. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Betzler. I will now call our discutant, first Elena Ferrante.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring talk, and this is a very, very interesting topic for me. So I would have 2 questions. You said that for empathy to occur, it must be based on dynamic relationship between subject and target. However, so it means that without this relationship, empathy cannot happen. But let us go back to your example, and let us introduce another figure. So there is Elena, who is friend of Leah, but not friend of Olga. Okay. And Leah, who is very concerned about Olga's situation, talks about it with Elena, who also suffered similar experience. So Elena feels angry with Mario and feels sorry for Olga, but the 2 women never meet. So, and let us imagine there is no possibility for them to establish direct relationship. It seems for me that those feelings that Elena feels that this is the case of empathy, that Elena empathizes with Olga's situation. Very good. So second question, and it is also related to your example. Let us now imagine another scenario. Olga, who suffered a loss throughout her life, does not feel very much at in this situation. So, or even more, let us imagine that she feels guilty. She thinks that if only she was better wife, Mario would stay with her, and I think this is not very unusual.
Quite to the contrary. Quite to the contrary.
So Leah, when she listens to Olga's interpretation of her situation, she simply feels angry with Mario and she feels sorry for Olga. But she understands why Olga has this feeling. Like, let us imagine that she was abandoned as a child, that throughout her life she suffered so much that she simply is either adjusted to suffering or she got this feeling that she is guilty for all the suffering she went through. So Leah does not affirm that Olga's emotional perspective on her situation is justified. But being a sensitive person, she does not go and say to Olga, "You're all wrong, let me say how you should feel in this situation." And then she's there for Olga and they talk and Leah helps her in everyday commitments and basically she conveys to Olga that Olga matters to her. And slowly, and this is obviously a very optimistic scenario, Olga starts to realize that it is not her that she is worth, so that this builds up her self-esteem, and slowly she becomes angry with Mario. So now their feelings are
the same.
The same. So does Leah empathize with Olga in the first place?
These are wonderful examples, which put me under some pressure, which is good. So thank you so much for thinking about it. I think the second scenario maybe is a little easier for me to answer, but it's still very interesting. And I think interesting objections one has to tackle to actually make the case the way I want to make it. You're right, there are cases where empathy in that sense, in the sense we described, is not even required, and that seems to be such a case where Leah already thinks that Olga gets things wrong, right? She shouldn't be feeling guilty. And then Leah can't be required to empathize with these guilt feelings because because these feelings are not justified in her view. And you're totally right in that case. I think Leah it's much better for Leah to sort of sensitively show to her friend that she could view the situation differently, and if you like, not empathize with her. So I agree with this description. I think I don't need to say that all there is to a relation or relationship is empathy. So I think sometimes other things matter. So it's not an exclusive, that's why I said building block. It can help to build relationships, and it can be sometimes morally required. But you're right, it's certainly not morally required if you already know the truth, or if you have a better perspective, then you shouldn't reaffirm the worst perspective of the other. That would be even immoral to do that, right? So all I wanted to say, and all I need to say, I think, is that sometimes empathy can be an important constitutive value for relationships, but it's not the only one, so we can do without it in some cases, and there are even relationships that work without empathy. So in that sense, I don't think it's necessary. So I never wanted to say it's like strictly necessary to empathize to have a relationship. But if we have good reasons to empathize, if we come to see things the same way, I think it does help to build up relationships. But it's a wonderful example. And the first one, I think I might have missed something. So Elena is somebody who doesn't know Olga, right? So, but she empathizes with Olga because Leah told her about it. Okay. Also very tricky. I guess I would construct the case such that it is, well, maybe some sort of relation via their shared friend.
But then, what is, let me say, if we see people are suffering around the world and there are children dying of hunger, and we feel that very strongly, and this feeling gives us reason to do whatever there is in our position to help. Is this helping out of empathy, or or something else?
Like, if you mean like if you don't, I think I think that's a different case you mentioned now, because if it's not, sometimes advertisements capitalize on that, because then there is a single child that looks very cute, and then I think you come to empathize because there's an individual. And then it's often used in some, even though it's for a good thing, it can be used in very manipulative ways. That works sometimes, but if we talk about empathizing with poor children in the world, I'd be inclined to say that's not empathy, but sympathy, which is not that this is bad, but that's a different attitude in that we just are concerned about the well-being in others. And like not take perspective of like this child, that's just not possible, I think, right? But sometimes like one child is used as a representative of a whole group. And then our psychological mechanisms come into play and can very easily also be misused, right? That's why I'm always doubtful if advertisement makes use of that. But I think the first example, this Elena example, is slightly different. And I have to think about it more because it's really interesting. Maybe we say it's a relation via the shared friend. Another answer would be, even though you said it's empathy, maybe it's not really empathy, but some sort of projection. You hear about somebody who undergoes something that you've experienced, and then you project a lot of your own stuff on that person, and you think you empathize, or you feel very close, but in fact you're not. You're actually being a bit narcissistic about your own story, because you don't engage and try to understand that other person's perspective. That might be another way to accommodate that case, but it depends on how we portray the case, and it's definitely very interesting. Thank you so much.
The question is that one I have a brief comment. Related to the question, do we always have to justify the other's emotion when we empathize with them? But I'm not so skeptical about it.
Okay.
I think that probably we should call something empathy, not justifying emotion of the person. We speak about justification of emotion usually in relation to the formal object, but we could see that, for example, someone is wrongly feeling danger, but he still empathizes with him being afraid.
Okay, also very good. Maybe this trades on an ambiguity of the term justification, and this brings me to think maybe I shouldn't use the term justification at all. Maybe it's too strong, because all I wanted to say is not like, this is the truth, what you feel, but what I wanted to say, by coming to feel the way you feel, I mean something weaker. I provide additional support that how you feel is somehow meeting the formal object, as you say. If you're afraid, and I come to feel afraid because I put myself in your perspective, I think I provide additional support to your perspective. You know what I mean? Whereas you think, did I hear you correctly that you thought, well, sometimes we empathize even though we think the person gets it wrong?
Yeah. For example, we see person being afraid from a very small dog, but we don't think that it is justified to be afraid of that dog, but still we empathize with this person.
Well, I have another paper with a colleague called Simon Keller on precisely that topic, and our tendency is to think that empathy actually puts strong pressure on belief. So if I have a different belief, if I think this dog is not dangerous and you're like this, I think it's very difficult to empathize if I think your emotion underlies a belief that's wrong. We sometimes do that with small children, but maybe children are different cases, and we do that out of a different concern for trauma. But like, if I think you're just wrong, you know, I wouldn't feel your feelings. I would say, well, look, this is just a small dog. It doesn't even have teeth, and there's nothing to worry about. But I know.
I'm sure that we don't do it like the children. I probably got more complex examples that there is probably social or cultural disagreement about criterions of formal appropriateness, where we find a situation of authority, but still empathizing with someone afraid or feeling vulnerable or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hear this objection for the first time. The other take is to say, well, maybe these are mixed cases where we do try to empathize, even though we think the emotion is based on a wrong perception. And we do that for some other relational reason, because, you know, either because the relationship is really important for us, or because something really important is at stake. And maybe we then do that. And then you're right, but I would still say, if we do that, we do provide further support to that person's perspective. And that goes back to your interesting example. There might be a danger in that, because I reinforce, by empathizing, I might reinforce the person's wrong emotional take on things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think we have that, if not too much, if we think the person can bear it, we might empathize to some degree, but then point out to the person, but you know, you should be looking at things differently. I think we sometimes are morally required to do that, but it depends on the case. So you can tell it's a messy field.
Well, I want to continue actually what both you asked and commented in a way. When you were, it was really interesting presentation, thank you, very interactive. When you were talking, I was thinking about one thing, and now I could add also two other things. I was thinking about compassion.
Okay.
As a concept. And when I asked for the distinction between empathy of Elena and empathy of Leah in this case, I felt that, in my opinion at least, I would say that Elena has a feeling of compassion, but not feeling of empathy.
Thank you. That's up my alley. I like that.
Because she feels those emotions, the same like Olga had, but what misses in the picture is she doesn't have any, let's say, a relationship. She doesn't make any action towards Olga. And I would say in your concept, at least as far as I could understand it, you require action between two persons in order for empathy to exist.
Or maybe
express
exchange, how whatever action is, sort of an exchange to sort of adjust and see and actually get it.
Something you require from Leah to actively show that she feels with Olga in the first place. So I think that could be maybe difference between these two things, and therefore I think that action or this acting something is important, important factor in this context. But in relation to what Igor asked, I think that there is, when you see someone who is acting really afraid of a small dog, you understand him, like rationally understand, but you do not feel the fear. And that's why this is not empathy.
Then it's cognitive. Some people call that cognitive empathy, but not full-blown.
Exactly. I just want to comment.
But you have to in some way feel that he is feeling fear.
You understand. You understand that he feels afraid. I can understand, but I cannot feel that fear.
You don't. That's the. That's the interesting. I mean, this is. Go ahead.
No, I would probably think that then we go too much to the shared emotions rather than empathy. From this in my opinion. If I have to feel fear from the dog, then I have to feel from them.
Well, that's at least how effective empathy is defined, that I have to sort of similarly feel how you feel. Otherwise, it's just, it's cognitive, and I could say, oh yeah, I sort of know what it means to be afraid of a dangerous animal. So I have to make all these inferences. And I know the feeling of being afraid from other contexts, and I take I put all this information together to sort of figure out and infer from that, that's how you must be feeling, but actually this is just a small dog. So I don't effectively empathize because I'm not similarly afraid of this particular dog. I just sort of know this is how one feels when one is afraid and thinks there's a dangerous animal in front of me. And we can do that. We can sort of imagine ourselves into other situations to that extent. That we sort of get at it, but it's not feeling.
I also think that we could, let's say, feel the significance the situation has with some another, still not sharing his justification of why this situation is significant, but still feeling that this situation is significant for probably some kind of smaller condition.
It's a weaker condition, but since the stuff is so messy, it's helpful to be clear on that. And I should skip the word justification. I mean like additional support. So, yeah.
Do you want something more about the other question?
I actually want to ask.
Okay. Fine.
You were talking, basically, I guess, I know the answer, but you talk about empathy always in relation to individual, never in relation to group.
Okay.
I was just thinking it's possible
to empathize with the whole group.
Yes. I was thinking, for example, on I remember in former Yugoslavia, we were like, not empathy, we were like helping people in Africa because we were like.
That's what I would. I mean, the way it's defined, it's a tricky thing because, we don't have a clear intuitive grasp what empathy is, and the way psychologists study is pretty different from what philosophers talk about it. So it's a whole mess. So in a way, we also have to settle on what definition does what job. So the way it's standardly defined, even though there are many differences, is that people think I have to sort of simulate a singular person's perspective. And since each individual's perspective differs so much from other people's perspective, it seems difficult.
Shared there is a group of people who share some feeling about some other group who is in danger, for example. I don't know if it's really.
I haven't thought about this. I don't rule this entirely out, that there is something like a group feeling, and in virtue of being a member of a group, can I empathize with my group in having that feeling? Maybe.
Why not? Why not? There is a crisis, there is no electricity, 20 babies in the hospital are in danger. You can empathize with 20 babies, not with one. All babies are in danger. I empathize with all.
Well, it's more like we have like collective action here towards aiding refugees. So in a way, we as a group felt something shared, similar towards the whole group, which was external group, but still we felt something towards them, and then we engaged as a group to assist them in a way. So there is like action also, there is a feeling.
But maybe that's because, in these cases, these are groups that all undergo the same experiences, Like if you take the refugees, we assume it must be terrible to be a refugee and lose one's own homeland, etc., etc. And then maybe what we actually do is sort of think about one individual and sort of project that on that group, because we know the group must feel the same way. Because what troubles me is when we talk about group empathy, that usually people, it depends on what situation we're talking about, but usually people have very different perspectives. And then it's very tricky to say we empathize, I empathize with you and you and you, because I might have to empathize with very conflicting perspectives, right? But in these kinds of cases, they're not conflicting perspectives. And then maybe we might be, but I guess we need an additional story how we do that. Is that a singular we take as a representative of all the other 19 babies, or is it really, what's going on? That's something that needs to be spelled out more, and maybe that's feasible. I haven't thought about the collective case really, but when it comes to empathy.
Okay, we have 4 more questions. Please be brief.
I'm too long. You should say be brief to me, not to the others.
So I was just thinking down the line of something that Igor asked.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's suppose this is the following situation. 2 people that have different phobias meet. And the one has a phobia of dogs and the other has of elevators. And the one that has the phobia of dog sees the dog and he gets scared. And the other one says, I'm not, he has a cognitive empathy, and he says, okay, I'm not scared of the dog, but I also have a phobia, and I know how it feels to have a phobia, so he's empathizing. In a sense, he's feeling the fear of the dog because he has the fear of the elevator.
Okay, that's what Bennett Helm, the philosopher Bennett Helm, who also writes on emotions, calls subfocus. So that's a perfect example for that. You don't share his fear of this dog, but you share the phobia because you're familiar with it. And so we can re-describe the case, or subfocus, or however you want to call this, and say they do share the experiences, and in that sense, empathy might be possible.
So they do feel fear in this.
But that's another tricky, messy case, or mixed case that makes it difficult to have very precise claims about the phenomenon. But it's because the phenomenon is difficult. Yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I'd go along with that. That if I'm familiar with that's what. But maybe that's empathy under a slightly different description. So I empathize with you being in a phobic situation, and I don't empathize with you being afraid of this particular dog. So you don't get the full empathy for this particular, in that regard, I don't support you, but I support you in a sub-focus manner in, we too, who have phobic states. And that's possible, that's true. Thank you.
Okay, Julia?
Just a quick question. I'm more and more interested in negative acts. So I'm wondering if empathy is sort of obligation, you seem to suggest that it is. What happens in the case of betrayal, for example? I empathize with you and yet you betray me. Am I obliged to keep empathizing even with betrayal, or am I allowed morally to stop?
Yeah.
And if I'm obliged to keep empathizing with you, on what grounds is that justification made? If there was a betrayal or interruption of empathy in a way.
But that would be a case where you know that I betray you.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so if you know this, I don't think there is any obligation whatsoever to empathize. Because, I mean, betrayal is typically at least, is an act where somebody actually destroys the relation. I mean, it depends on the situation of what betrayal precisely is, etc., etc. But like typically one would say that somebody's ending actually the relationship by doing that, and then you don't have any, you lose any obligatory basis. to create further relationship goods, how I would put it, because the other person already stopped doing that by betraying you. So that would be my answer to that.
Mario?
Right, as this discussion goes on, more and more points come to my mind.
Yeah, that's always a good sign of a discussion.
First, let me just briefly comment on Sally's example. It seems to me that, of course, we need a very, very differentiated conceptual scheme to capture different modalities of empathy. Now, the one you used is quite demanding, the one based on the example of Elena Ferrante's book.
Mm-hmm.
It points toward the complex relationships between two singular persons and the kind of nexus that is built between them that can then facilitate also moral reasoning on the part of the participants. But what Sally is referring to is a much more general kind of affect that one feels. So we don't empathize with the 20 babies in danger in the sense that empathy was defined in the lecture. We do not open up towards the perspective of the babies in order to be able to have the emotional state E prime, which correlates with the emotional state E within the babies. You seem to have a very generalized fear for the babies. So this is a kind of affect that might not best be termed empathy at all.
I agree. But then it could be called sympathy or compassion. Maybe that's not even empathy, but we sort of have concern for these poor babies.
Concern would be a better term. Now, my main point, when you reflect on standpoints that examine causal relationships between empathy and morality, you quite quickly conclude that the causal models are deficient, but you refer to the most general kind of and the most demanding causal claim that empathy is the basis of morality, and thereby you conclude rightly that that's not the case, and then you dismiss the whole causality kind of model of that relationship between empathy and morality. It seems to me that there are many more nuances and many more issues related to the causality problem, and I'd just like to offer two brief examples which pertain to let's say, issues of social change and morality. Briefly. So it seems to me that there's a two-way kind of complex causal relationship between empathy, the way you understand it, and morality, which does not go all the way to saying that empathy is the basis of morality or the other way around. But my first example, I would say that there is a causal relationship between empathy and morality in the sense that empathy can generate new forms of moral reasoning or expand existing forms of moral reasoning. Let's say within an ancient slave ownership society, a person X observes how a person Y, who is a slave owner, abuses a person Z, who is a slave. Now, the person X has been socialized, interiorized in a norm whereby if the person Z, who is a slave, disobeys the master has every right to abuse him. That's what the person X has learned since childhood. However, the person X feels empathy toward person Z. What can happen afterwards is a moral learning process whereby the person X expands from moral reasoning and understands that the person Z is a fully fledged human being, and empathy had a causal power in that situation. So there is this direction, it seems to me, where empathy can be an important factor in moral learning processes. Now, the opposite example, how, in my opinion, moral reasoning or value rationality, to call it in Max Weber's terms, can also have a generative power with respect to empathy. Let's imagine this situation. Once again, a person X witnesses how a person Y abuses a person Z. Now, a person Z has certain idiosyncratic traits which makes it difficult for person X to empathize with her initially. This refers to your examples of, characteristics of some people which obstruct feelings of empathy, let's say. Now, initially the person X does not feel empathy for the person Z who's being abused. However, the person X has interiorized the moral norm
which is, let's say, universalist, that all human beings must not be abused. It seems to me that in such situations, moral reasoning itself can facilitate empathy. So initially I don't feel empathy toward person Z because I feel antipathy toward this person. But my moral reasoning starts when I see the abuse. It can be a vehicle for releasing empathy toward person Z. Now what happens afterwards, my abstract moral reasoning might not have been sufficient to compel me to act to prevent the abuse. But once I feel empathy, triggered by the moral reasoning, my abstract moral principle suddenly is buttressed by empathy, let's call it. And I have sufficient motivation to act, sufficient courage to act now, let's say. So there I see an even more complicated relationship between empathy and moral reasoning. Sorry.
No, these are excellent cases. Thank you very much. You're right. Well, you're right. I think this sounds very plausible, the two examples. And I don't want to object to that. I guess maybe I started out too strongly, and it's true one of my targets is somebody who does have a very strong claim about empathy and morality, namely Michael Sloat. And I'm opposed to the view that empathy always leads to moral motivation. But you're right, that's in a way it's a straw man because it's too simple a view. Because obviously, depending on the emotions, depending on the context, it doesn't lead to anything. Because not every situation is moral, even though somebody feels something, etc., etc. That's true. And actually, but what you are trying to say, or what you pointed to, that sometimes there are interesting connections between empathy and moral action. The second case is different, but it's also very interesting. Is maybe what I tried to get at the end, that sometimes empathy gives us moral reasons, or we haven't, but I tried to capture it in the reasons terminology, which maybe is not just causal, right? But sometimes we do have reasons to empathize, and it goes further. You're right. Sometimes empathy might yield moral reasons, and in that sense, I think I take that on board. You complicate the picture more, but that doesn't matter. I think it is, there are interesting connections between empathy and morality. Right now, I tend to think they are more than just causal. Because in your learning process, or when you say moral reasoning can facilitate empathy, I think once we reason properly, morally, we come to see the other person whom we initially disliked. We come to see that person in a different perspective, right? And then we see that that person is a locus of reason to act morally towards her, that that person is a person, and not just some idiot that doesn't deserve my respect.
We also feel affective relational, something that we haven't felt previously.
Yeah.
It's not just abstract reason.
Right, but I guess I'd still be inclined to say that emotions can be responses to reasons.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not just some irrational causal thing. So then I'd be inclined to say even something stronger than you indicated, that we come to respond to reasons, which is actually, this is a super example, because I just heard something on the radio yesterday on implicit bias, how biased we are towards people who look differently than we Europeans do. And the more you engage with these studies, the more you come to see how biased we are, and that actually helps to sort of reframe people to whom you initially have sort of an anti-reaction, because they look differently. And you come to see them as a source of reasons, if you like. So thank you. I take that on board, but capture it in a stronger way in terms of reasons. Thanks.
We can put more question, will be very brief. Patrick Doe, who is also our guest today from Indiana.
Thanks for the talk.
So thank you for coming.
I had a two-part question. One, does the empathetic theory of morality rely on a kind of a humanism that presupposes an anthropocentric view of the world?
That presupposes?
Presupposes an anthropocentric
view
of the world. Could there be an empathetic relationship that did not privilege the human as the center and as the source of the second question kind of relates to what you just said about bias. George and I were talking today in a completely different context about questions about race. And we ended up kind of revolving around the question of tribalism. Tribalism is a sort of a difficult to define dynamic that informs our outlook on the other when we happen to encounter another in ways that are hard to predict but are hard to control. So if our encounter with the other is sort of pre-shaped and overdetermined by these non-moral forces, they might be ethnic, they might be cultural, they might be linguistic, they might be economic, who knows? But whatever it is that generates tribalism, how does the question, how does the emphasis on empathy respond to that? Which seems to be out of the realm of morality.
Yeah, very good questions. As to the anthropocentrism, I guess the angle I'm looking at it might sound anthropocentric because I'm interested in human relationships. But I don't mean it to be anthropocentric if one wants to extend it to other non-human animals. I just haven't thought about this. I guess it is possible to empathize with them, animals. That was just not my primary interest, but I did not mean to rule out or to say it's only humans who can do this and they are the primordial, I don't know, entities in this universe. That wasn't my intention. Now, as for tribalism, that's also interesting. I mean, I do think empathy has these dangers, right? Like what some people call partiality. Tribalism sounds even worse. That we if we take that as a natural tendency we have, I think we are driven by these amoral forces, or that it's easier for us naturally to empathize with people who are close to us under some description, and that this is an amoral condition. Now, what do we do with that? When it comes to human relationships, I'd still be inclined to say, as long as we don't harm others, there can be value in, being close to particular others, even if we choose them in part on amoral reasons or amoral considerations. If I feel a friendship for somebody, I think there's value in that, no matter whether that person is also of my skin color or not. But then, even if we admit that, there's value in relationships as long as these are not harmful relationships. And there's value in empathy because it brings us close to others. Then we have to stop and think about, what harm can that do when it comes to morality in the larger scheme of things. And there I think we have to limit it. Empathy has its limits. Because sometimes there are concerns or moral considerations that pertain to other human beings or to animals or other entities that have nothing to do with this, what I call relational value of empathy. And then we need to understand it doesn't take everything to realize that, or it's not necessary to realize that relational empathy, that's all about it. But sometimes we have to step back and think there are other moral concerns that matter more than that particular relational value of empathy. And we have to balance it sometimes. So I guess that was one of my driving forces, to think about this intricate connection between empathy and other moral considerations that have nothing to do with empathy.
One more question, Alexandra.
I'll be very brief, so just a comment. I think you should introduce another concept into this discussion. In a theory of mind, I wouldn't use cognitive empathy or something like that. It psychology, developmental psychology, and it is actually the capacity to understand the reasons behind someone's feelings, emotions, and behaviors, and to accurately predict someone's emotions and so on based on the empirical evidence that you have. So it's more of a cognitive phenomena, whereas empathy is more of an emotional phenomena. It's the capacity to feel what someone else is feeling, whereas theory of mind is the capacity to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to acquire the perspective of someone else. So I think introducing this theory of mind concept answers some of the dilemmas that we are having. It probably clarifies some dilemmas that we have if we just have theory of mind on one side and empathy on the other.
And by empathy meaning effective empathy, right?
Yeah, only effective. That's how I think it's best to
keep these two things apart, which I want to keep apart. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I take this as a comment, and so thanks very much.
So, thank you, Professor Betzler.
Thank you.